My name is Renee Calloway. I'm 38 years old, and the last thing my mother ever gave me was a trash bag. Not a gift bag, not a box wrapped in paper, a brown paper grocery bag with the handles twisted together and a dime store twist tie holding them closed. Gerald Puckett, my mother's attorney, a man who had known our family for over 20 years, placed it on his desk like it was perfectly ordinary, looked at me, and said, "Your mother left this for you." My sister Tamsin was sitting 2 feet away from me wearing our mother's pearls. I want you to hold that image for a second, because that moment, that specific, surreal, almost cinematic moment, is the one I keep coming back to. The bag on the desk, the pearls at my sister's throat, and Gerald's face, which told me absolutely nothing and somehow everything. I didn't cry. I didn't say anything. I just picked up the bag. I didn't know yet what was inside it. I didn't know that what looked like an insult was actually the most deliberate act of love my mother ever performed. I didn't know any of that. All I knew was that it was heavy, and that it made a sound when I lifted it, the soft rustle of paper inside paper, and that Tamsin was watching me with an expression she was working very hard to keep neutral. That's where this story starts. Right there, in that office above the hardware store in Morgantown, with the space heater ticking in the corner, and the smell of old paper, and the weight of that bag in my hands. But to understand what it meant, I have to take you back. All the way back to a kitchen table, and a woman who didn't know I was watching her cry. Before I do, if you're already feeling something watching this, if something about that image landed somewhere close to home, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It sounds like a small thing, but it genuinely matters to me to know who's on the other side of this. And like this video, it helps more than you know. Okay, let me take you back to the beginning. My mother, Doris Calloway, was not a cold woman. I want to say that clearly because it would be easy, and maybe more satisfying, to tell you she was. She wasn't cold. She was contained. There is a difference, even if the effect on a child feels identical. She grew up in a family where love was a practical arrangement. You kept the house, you showed up, you didn't complain. She brought that understanding with her into our house in Morgantown, and she ran it the same way. The refrigerator was always stocked. The laundry was always done. We always had what we needed for school. And she almost never said she loved us out loud. My father, Gary, left when I was 9. I don't have a lot of feelings about that anymore. I used to, but they've gone quiet over the years. What I remember most about the time right after he left is how Doris didn't fall apart. She just recalibrated, tightened the budget, took on more hours at the department store where she worked alterations, made sure nothing visible changed in our lives. She was, by the only metrics she had been given, a good mother. But there was a scale in our house, and from as early as I can remember, Tamsin and I were on different sides of it. Tamsin is 5 years older than me, which means she got more of my parents before the marriage started to crack. She was louder, more emotionally demanding, the kind of kid who would cry until something happened. And Doris, who needed the crying to stop, learned that responding to Tamsin was efficient. It worked. And Renee, quiet Renee, easy Renee, Renee who never makes a fuss, could wait. I became the easy one. Not because I didn't need things, because I learned that needing things was inconvenient. So I just stopped asking. I was 11 years old when I found my mother at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, crying over a stack of bills she had spread out like she was trying to do a puzzle she already knew she couldn't solve. I stood in the doorway in my socks, and I made a decision in about 4 seconds. I sat down next to her. I didn't ask what was wrong. I didn't say anything. I just stayed there until she was done crying, and then she went back to bed, and in the morning she made eggs and never mentioned it. I think about that a lot. The fact that I knew, at 11, that what she needed was not a question, but a presence. That I had already learned to give without being asked. I thought it was a virtue. For a very long time, I thought it was just who I was. What I didn't understand until much, much later is that my mother had been watching me every time. If you've ever been the easy one, the one everyone assumed was fine because you never said otherwise, I think you already know exactly what I mean. And I want to ask you something right now, before I keep going. Has anyone in your family ever made you feel like your silence was a gift they could keep taking? Like being low maintenance was the same thing as being okay? Drop it in the comments, because I read every single one, and I have a feeling I'm not the only person in this story. I graduated from West Virginia University in 4 years, accounting degree. I worked 2 jobs the entire time, a coffee counter on campus and weekend shifts at a grocery store 3 miles from my apartment. I graduated with $4,200 in savings and a firm handshake from nobody in particular because my mother didn't come to the ceremony. She wasn't sick. She wasn't working. Tamsin had a thing, some event with her kids, and Doris didn't want to drive alone, so she didn't come. I found out from her the week before graduation, on the phone. She told me like she was reading off a list. "I don't think I'm going to be able to make it up there, Renee." And I said, "Okay." And we talked about something else, and I hung up and sat on my apartment floor for a while. I did not call her back and tell her it mattered. I did not cry in a way that changed anything. I went to my own graduation alone, shook the hand of a dean I had never met, and drove myself to a diner where I had pancakes and a coffee and read the newspaper. I told you I was the easy one. The person who did show up was my friend Marcia Hendricks, who had driven up from Charleston on no notice, who appeared at my apartment door at 7 in the morning the day of the ceremony with a gas station balloon that said, "Congrats, grad," and a large coffee, and who spent the whole day treating my graduation like the occasion it was. Marcia has been one of about 3 constants in my adult life. She is the kind of person who notices what time it is before she cancels, who remembers what you mentioned once 3 months ago, who shows up with a gas station balloon and does not make a thing of it. I did not fully understand her value for years. That is one of the things I most regret. When I moved to Charleston for work, a staff accountant position at a regional healthcare system, Marcia was already there. And for the first time in my adult life, I had a zip code that belonged to me, a routine that nobody had designed for me, and enough distance from Morgantown that I could breathe at a different pace. I want to be clear, I was not running away. I was running toward something. I just didn't have a word for it yet. The word, I think, was mine. The calls from Morgantown didn't stop just because I moved. They changed frequency, the way a radio station does when you drive far enough. Still audible, but with static underneath everything. Tamsin called on major holidays, which sounds generous until you understand that the calls were never really about checking in. They were status updates, a recitation of what she had, what her kids were doing, what the house looked like since they redid the kitchen, and somewhere in the middle of all that, almost as an afterthought, a mention of our mother. "Mom seems okay. She's been tired." And then back to the kitchen renovation. I called Doris directly, once a week, on Sunday evenings. The calls lasted between 8 and 14 minutes. I timed them once, not out of resentment, just out of curiosity. We talked about the weather, about her garden, about whether the pharmacist had gotten her prescription right this time. She asked how work was going. I said fine. She said good. We hung up with a phrase neither of us had ever examined. Talk soon. That was our relationship for 11 years. Functional, consistent, and almost completely surface. And then 2 years before she died, Doris was diagnosed with a degenerative neurological condition that her doctors said would progress slowly and then quickly. She did not call me to tell me. She told Tamsin, and Tamsin sent me a text. The text said, "Mom has some health stuff going on. She's handling it. Thought you should know." I drove up the following Saturday. I sat with my mother for 3 hours in the living room, where the furniture had not moved in 30 years. She told me the diagnosis calmly, in the same tone she used to recite grocery lists. I asked her what she needed. She said she was fine. I asked if she was scared. She looked at me for a moment, a real look, not the surface one, and said, "I've been more scared of other things." I didn't ask what. I wish I had. What I didn't know, driving back to Charleston that Saturday night, was that Tamsin had already begun positioning herself. I found this out gradually, and I found it out through Marcia, who still had roots in Morgantown through her aunt, who went to the same church as two of Doris's friends. And what Marcia started relaying to me, carefully, because Marcia is not a gossip, she was telling me because she thought I had a right to know, was a version of me that I didn't recognize. According to the narrative being built in Morgantown, I had left. Just left. Moved away and checked out, barely called, never came back unless it was convenient. Doris was struggling, and I was living my comfortable life in Charleston, not doing my share. Tamsin, by contrast, was there every week, driving Doris to her appointments, sitting with her at the neurologist, managing her medications and her calendar and her grocery deliveries. Some of that was true. Tamsin was there more than I was geographically. I knew that. I had never pretended otherwise. But what the narrative left out was that I had offered 3 separate times to take over the medical coordination, to be the one tracking the appointments and communicating with the doctors, because that is the kind of thing I am actually good at. And all 3 times, Tamsin had said she had it handled. "I've got it, Renee. You don't need to come up." I believed her. I let her have it. Because I was still, at 36 years old, the easy one. What I didn't understand until later is that Tamsin needed to be the one handling it. She needed the visible hours. She was building something, a case, a record, a story, and I kept handing her material without knowing it. I want to ask you something right now, because this is the part that still sits in my chest in a way I haven't fully resolved. Have you ever trusted someone with a responsibility and later realized they had accepted it not to help you, but to use it? Not out of love, but out of strategy? I'm not asking to be dramatic. I genuinely want to know if you felt that specific thing. The realization that someone's helpfulness was actually a form of claim staking. Drop that in the comments, because understanding that I wasn't alone in this was one of the things that helped me most. My mother's decline moved the way her doctor said it would, slowly and then very fast. The last 6 months were hospice, and I was there more than Tamsin's narrative allowed for, though I never said so publicly, never corrected anyone who was operating on her version of the story. I drove up most weekends. I sat with Doris. We watched television in the way you do when words have gotten too effortful, side by side, not quite talking, but not talking either. Once, about 2 months before she died, my mother turned to me during a commercial break and said, completely out of nowhere, "You were always the one I didn't have to worry about." I said, "I know." She looked back at the television. I have replayed that exchange so many times since then. You were always the one I didn't have to worry about. At the time, I heard it as confirmation. There it was, the quiet confession that I had always been the less important one, the easy one, the one who required no tending because she was assumed to be fine. That was the only way I knew how to hear it. I was wrong about what she meant, but I didn't know that yet. Doris died on a Tuesday in November, 6 weeks before the reading of the will. It was not dramatic. It was quiet in the way that feels almost wrong, like the ending doesn't match the weight of everything that came before it. I was there. Tamsin was there. We sat on opposite sides of the bed, and we didn't say anything to each other. And at some point, the room changed in a way that had nothing to do with sound. The administrative aftermath fell to me, because Tamsin said she was too overwhelmed. I was also overwhelmed. I did it anyway. I closed the accounts. I called the hospice to return the equipment. I fielded the calls from her doctor's office that kept coming in for 2 weeks because nobody had updated the system. I sat on hold with the insurance company for 43 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon, and I did not tell anyone it happened. Marcia brought me dinner twice that week. She didn't ask if I was okay. She just showed up with food and sat with me while I ate it, and both times she left before I got quiet in a way that would have required her to say something. She knew me well enough to know when my silences needed company and when they needed to be left alone. That was the hardest 6 weeks of my life. Not because I was destroyed by grief. I was grieving, but not the clean kind. I was grieving a relationship I had always wanted and never quite gotten, which is a different kind of loss. It doesn't come in waves. It's more like a low-grade ache that doesn't have a name, that you can't explain to people when they ask how you're holding up, because the honest answer is, I'm fine, and also something I needed has been gone for a very long time, and now I've lost the chance to get it, and I can't explain that to someone who didn't grow up in my house. And then Gerald Puckett called. He was brief on the phone, professional. He said there was a will, and that both Tamsin and I should come in at our earliest convenience. He mentioned, without any particular inflection, that there were a few items he had been holding for me specifically. He said items, the way you say it when you don't want to say things. I drove up on a Thursday. I wore the charcoal sweater I always wear when I need to feel like I have my footing. I had my legal pad in my bag. I had no idea what was coming. What was sitting on Gerald's desk when I walked in? Between the manila folder and the green shaded lamp was a brown paper grocery bag with the handles twisted shut. Tamsin was already there. She had beaten me by 20 minutes and positioned herself in the better chair, and she was wearing our mother's pearl necklace and matching earrings, which she had apparently taken home after the funeral without mentioning it to anyone. She smiled at me when I walked in, a real smile, not a performance one, and said, "You look tired." I sat down in the other chair. Gerald opened the folder. Gerald read the will the way he did everything, without ceremony, without warmth, without cruelty. Just the words in the order they were written. The jewelry collection went to Tamsin. 4 pieces, the grandmother's engagement ring, 2 diamond brooches, and a gold bracelet that had belonged to Doris's own mother. The savings account, $11,200, also to Tamsin. The house had already been sold during Doris's illness, the proceeds noted in the document, the arrangement finalized before any of this became necessary. Gerald had helped her with that too. And then he paused. Not a dramatic pause, not the kind that signals something is coming, just the natural pause of a man who has reached the end of one section and is moving to the next. He reached down beside his desk and lifted the brown paper bag onto the surface between us. "Your mother left this for Renee," he said. Tamsin's face did something fast and small that she thought I didn't see. A tightening around the eyes, a recalibration. Then the neutral expression came back, and she said, in a voice she had clearly prepared, "Is that it?" Gerald looked at her over his glasses. "That's everything in the will, yes." "And the bag is, what, personal items?" "It's addressed to Renee," Gerald said, not unkindly, just completely. I picked up the bag. It was heavier than it looked, and it made that sound again, the soft rustle of paper inside paper. And I held it in my lap, and I didn't open it. Not there. Not with Tamsin 2 feet away, recalibrating behind her neutral face. Not in that room. We were outside in under 10 minutes. Tamsin walked to her car without saying goodbye, and I walked to mine, and I put the bag in the passenger seat, and I buckled it in, which I realize sounds strange, but I couldn't put it in the back. It felt wrong to put it in the back. I drove 40 minutes before I pulled over. There's a rest stop on Route 79 that I have stopped at probably 30 times in my life, every time I've made this drive. There's a picnic table that faces a tree line, and in November, the trees are bare, and you can see all the way back into the woods. And it's not beautiful exactly, but it's honest. Everything stripped down to what it actually is. I sat at that table and I opened the bag. Inside, a padded envelope, sealed. 3 folded letters in my mother's handwriting. 1 in her controlled early script, 2 in the shakier version from her last months. And a smaller sealed envelope with my name on it, and below my name in letters that had clearly cost her effort. Gerald has the rest. Show him this. I set the small envelope aside. I picked up the first letter, my mother's handwriting, 18 months ago, when she could still hold a pen the way she'd always held one. Blue ink, legal pad paper, the date at the top. She had always dated her letters, even casual ones, a habit I never asked her about and now never could. It began. You always thought I didn't see you. I need you to know that I saw everything. I read that line 4 times before I could move to the next one. This is the moment I keep trying to describe to people and can't. Not because the words aren't there, but because the words don't carry the weight of what it is to sit at a rest stop picnic table in November, 38 years old, holding a letter from your dead mother that begins by naming the exact thing you have been afraid of your entire life, and then refusing it. I saw everything. If that line hit you the way it hit me when I read it, if you know what it is to wait your whole life for someone to simply say, I see you, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't. It costs nothing and it means more than I can explain right now. I kept reading. The letter explained what I didn't yet know. Over 15 years, quietly, without telling anyone, Doris had been putting money aside into a separate account held in my name only. Not large amounts, $50 here, $100 there, whatever she could trim without it showing. She sold her own mother's silver through a dealer in Clarksburg over the course of 2 years. She had a secondary checking account that she'd opened at a different bank, one she paid for with cash, one Kevin had never known about and therefore Tamsin had never known about. The jewelry and the visible savings went to Tamsin. That was intentional. That was planned. The real asset went to me. And Doris wrote, in that controlled blue ink, before her hands started to shake, exactly why. Tamsin would spend it and it would be gone. She doesn't mean to, but she would. And Kevin has never been a safe place for money. You will use it for something real. You have always used things for something real. That is one of the things I most admire about you, even though I know I never said so. I put the letter down on the picnic table and looked at the tree line for a while. She had admired me. My mother had quietly admired me and had not said so for 38 years, and had instead placed the evidence in a grocery bag and left it to a Tuesday in November and a rest stop on Route 79 and a picnic table facing bare trees. I don't know if I was angry. I don't know if what I felt was even nameable. It was too many things pressed into the same space, grief and vindication and something that might have been love, a retroactive love, the realization that I had been loved all along in a language I had never learned to read. The second letter was shorter. It was about the account, specific numbers, the bank name, a reference number, and it ended with the instruction to give Gerald the sealed envelope. The third letter was the one that undid me completely. It had no preamble. It began, "You were 11 years old. You sat down next to me at the kitchen table, and you didn't say one word, and you just stayed. I have thought about that night almost every day since. Your father had just left. I didn't know how we were going to be okay. And you sat down next to me in your socks, and you stayed until I was done crying, and then you went back to bed, and you never made me explain it or feel ashamed of it. That was the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me. I have never known how to tell you that. I'm telling you now. I was at that picnic table for a long time. When I finally got back in my car, I called Marcia. She answered on the second ring, and I said, "She knew. The whole time she knew." And Marcia, who did not fully understand yet what I meant, said, "Of course she did, Renee." And somehow that was exactly the right thing. She didn't ask me to explain. She just confirmed it. I drove back to Charleston. I put the bag on my kitchen table. I read all 3 letters again, and then I opened the padded envelope. Inside was a photograph I had never seen. Me and my mother at the kitchen table, taken by someone I don't remember being there, when I was maybe 7 or 8. We are both looking at something off to the left of the frame. My mother has her hand on the back of my chair. Not on my shoulder, on the chair. The way someone touches something they want to protect without making a production of it. I called Gerald the next morning. He told me the sealed envelope I hadn't yet opened authorized him to transfer a designated account directly to me, $94,300 held in my name in an amendment to the will that had been notarized and properly filed. He told me it was not contestable. He also told me, quietly, that Doris had come to him when her diagnosis was still new and she still had full capacity, and that she had been very clear and very calm, and that she had told him she wanted to be sure it was done right, because she only had one chance to do it. I thought about my mother sitting across from Gerald in that office above the hardware store, in her early decline, while she could still drive herself there, and making this arrangement with the same practical precision she had applied to everything her entire life. Not sentimental, not dramatic, just making sure it was right. I called Tamsin. She had already spoken to a probate attorney by then, a friend of Kevin's, which told me everything about how the previous 12 hours had gone in her house. Her voice was careful in the way that means someone has been awake since 4 in the morning doing math. She asked what was in the bag. I told her there were personal letters. She asked if there was anything else. I said they were private. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I just want to make sure everything is being handled properly." "It is," I said. "Gerald is handling it." She filed the inquiry 3 days later. Her attorney claimed the amendment was invalid on procedural grounds, that Doris had lacked cognitive capacity at the time of signing. It was a clean accusation, and a vicious one, because to argue it required arguing that my mother hadn't known what she was doing at the moment she was most clearly doing exactly what she meant to do. I called Gerald. He said, "I was hoping she wouldn't do this. I was prepared for her to do this." That sentence told me everything I needed to know about how well Gerald Puckett had known our family. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. A conference room, not a courtroom. This was a probate dispute, not a trial. I spent those 3 weeks doing what I always do when I'm overwhelmed. I made lists. I tracked every document Gerald needed. I organized the timeline. I called the hospice for a copy of their cognitive assessment notes. I did not tell anyone except Marcia what was happening, and Marcia came to Charleston for the weekend before the hearing, and we made dinner and watched television, and at no point did she tell me it was going to be fine, because she knows me well enough to know I find that phrase insulting. The night before, I sat at my kitchen table with the photograph, me and my mother and her hand on the back of my chair, and I said, not out loud, just in the way you say things to people who are no longer there to hear them, "I understand now. I wish you had told me. I'm glad you told me." Then I put the photograph back in the bag, folded the handles shut, and went to bed. The conference room was on the second floor of a building downtown that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. There were 4 chairs on each side of a long table. Gerald sat beside me. Tamsin sat across from us with her attorney, a man named Bryce who wore a suit that was trying too hard and who had clearly been told that the strongest play was to move fast and confident. Tamsin was wearing the pearl necklace again. I don't know why I keep coming back to the pearls. Maybe because they were the first thing I saw every time I looked at her. This visible claim, this preemptive declaration of inheritance worn around her throat like punctuation. Maybe because I understood, by that point, that the pearls were not about our mother. They were about the story Tamsin needed to be true. Bryce opened by laying out the procedural argument. The amendment had been signed 14 months before Doris's death, during the early stage of her decline, and he had a letter from a general practitioner suggesting that cognitive changes had been observed as early as 18 months prior. It was not a strong letter. It was the kind of document you get when you ask a question in a way designed to produce a particular answer. Gerald let him finish. He did not interrupt. He did not write anything down. He just listened with the patience of a man who had been holding the correct cards for over a year and was in no hurry to play them. Then he opened his folder. 2 physician attestations, one from Doris's neurologist, one from her hospice intake physician, both confirming full cognitive capacity at the time the amendment was signed. A notary statement. The amendment itself, which Bryce had seen only in summary. And within the amendment, in Doris's own language, a clause that Gerald read aloud without editorializing. I am making this decision with full understanding of its effect. I am not confused about what I am doing or why. I am correcting something I did not have the courage to correct while she was standing in front of me. The room was quiet after that. Bryce looked at his papers. The look of a man recalculating. Tamsin looked at the table. The mediator, a woman in her 50s who had the expression of someone who had seen every version of this particular story, made a note on her pad and said, without looking up, I don't see a viable basis for the capacity challenge. Bryce said something about wanting to review the attestations. The mediator said he was welcome to. Gerald closed his folder. The inquiry was dismissed in under an hour. In the parking lot afterward, Tamsin caught up with me before I reached my car. She was not crying. She looked the way people look when the performance has run out of runway. Not broken, just empty. Like a room after everyone has left. She said, "She could have just told me." I looked at her, and I thought about everything I now knew. About the 15 years of $50 deposits. About the silver sold quietly in Clarksburg. About my mother sitting across from Gerald with her hands folded and her diagnosis new and her mind still clear and her intentions completely, irreversibly her own. I thought about Tamsin driving to Morgantown every week and logging those hours and genuinely believing that proximity was the same thing as being seen. I said, she could have told both of us a lot of things. Tamsin looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded, very slightly. Not in agreement exactly, but in the way you nod when you've run out of argument and what's left is just the truth sitting there between 2 people with nowhere to go. She walked to her car. I walked to mine. I did not feel victorious. I want to be clear about that. I felt tired in a way that went all the way down, and underneath the tiredness, there was something beginning to settle. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of the ground becoming solid. The feeling of something that has been unresolved for a very long time finally arriving at its last sentence. The weeks after the hearing moved quietly. I didn't have to do anything. I want to emphasize that. I did not make calls. I did not correct narratives. I did not tell anyone in Morgantown what had happened in that conference room. I just went back to Charleston and went back to work and let everything be what it was. What I heard, through Marcia, through her aunt, through the slow but total information transfer of a small community, was that Tamsin and Kevin had listed the house. The HELOC had gotten unmanageable. The renovation that was going to increase the property value had, in the estimation of 3 different realtors, added less value than it cost. They were moving into something smaller, closer to Kevin's parents. I did not tell anyone I knew this. I did not say I told you so to anyone, not even privately to myself. Because when Marcia told me, the feeling I had was not satisfaction. It was something closer to sadness, the recognition that Tamsin had bet everything on a story that couldn't hold her weight, and that the story had always been the problem, not the money. Doris's friends from church, two women named Pat and Loretta, who had known my mother for 30 years and who had been operating on Tamsin's version of events for at least 2, called me separately within the same week. Pat called first. She said she had heard things she wished she hadn't said, and that she hoped I knew my mother had talked about me with something that Pat described, after a pause, as quiet pride. She said it like she was offering me something she should have offered earlier. I thanked her. I meant it. Loretta called 3 days later and said less, just that she was sorry she hadn't reached out sooner, and that she remembered Doris mentioning, more than once, that I was the one who handled things. She said it like it was the best thing she could say about a person, Loretta told me. I don't think I understood that until recently. Neither of those calls fixed anything, but they mattered. Not because I needed the vindication. I had the letters, I had the photograph, I had the amendment in Doris's own words. I didn't need anyone to tell me I had been loved. I knew that now. They mattered because they were people choosing, late and imperfectly, to be accurate. And I have learned to receive imperfect gestures without dismissing them. I did not call Tamsin. Tamsin did not call me. That is not a wound I am tending. It is a silence I have accepted as the current shape of things. Maybe it changes. Maybe it doesn't. I am not waiting for it to resolve in a particular direction. 3 months after the hearing, I sat at my kitchen table on a Sunday evening, the same time I used to call Doris, the slot in the week that had gone quiet and stayed quiet. And I opened my legal pad. But not to make a list. I wrote my mother a letter. I told her I understood the kitchen table now. I told her I understood the bag, the account, the 15 years of $50 deposits, the silver sold in Clarksburg, the clause she had put in her own amendment because she wanted it on the record that she knew exactly what she was doing. I told her I understood that she had loved me in the only language she had, and that the language was imperfect, but the love was not. I told her about the thing I was going to do with some of the money, a continuing education program I had been looking at for 4 years and never registered for because I could never fully justify spending money on something that was purely for me. I had registered the week before. I told her about it in the letter the way you tell someone news you think they'll be glad to hear. I told her I was sorry I hadn't asked what she was scared of, that afternoon in the living room when she said she had been more scared of other things. I told her I thought I knew now what she meant. That the thing she had been most afraid of was exactly what she spent 15 years quietly making sure couldn't happen. I signed the letter with my name. Then I folded it, put it inside the brown paper bag, and twisted the handles closed. I kept the bag on the kitchen table for a while. Then I moved it to the shelf above my desk, next to the photograph. Me and my mother, her hand on the back of my chair, both of us looking at something neither of us could name. Marcia came over that Saturday. She saw the bag on the shelf and she didn't ask about it. She made coffee and I made eggs, and we sat at the table the way we have been sitting at tables together for 15 years. And at some point, she looked at me across the kitchen and said, "You seem different." I said, "I think I might be." She nodded and looked back at her coffee and said, "Good." That was it. That was the whole conversation. And it was exactly enough. The $94,300 has been sitting in its own account since November. I have used $12,000 of it for the continuing education program which started last month, which I attend on Tuesday evenings in a classroom that smells like dry erase markers, and which I drive to alone and sit in the front row of, and which is entirely, completely, 100% mine. Nobody knows about it except Marcia. I haven't announced it. I haven't explained it. I registered under my name and I show up every Tuesday and I take notes on a legal pad. And when I drive home, I feel something I am still learning to identify because I have not felt it often enough to have a ready word for it. The best I can describe it is this. It feels like being seen by myself. My name is Renee Calloway. I'm 38 years old, and I finally understand that the trash bag was never an insult. It was a delivery system. It was my mother's way of saying, "This is for you alone," and I made sure nobody could take it. She was right that I would use it for something real. She was right about a lot of things she never said out loud. I think about the kitchen table at 2 a.m. I think about sitting down next to her in my socks and staying without being asked and not saying a word. I thought I was giving her something that night. It turns out she was watching me and deciding something. It turns out she spent the next 27 years making good on whatever she decided. I just didn't know it until she was gone. Before you go, I want to ask you something. And I mean this genuinely, not as a formality. Has someone ever loved you in a language you couldn't read until it was almost too late? Has someone ever protected you quietly in a way you only understood after you stopped being angry long enough to look at what they'd actually done? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one, and I have never said that to fill space. I mean it. If this story stayed with you, if something in it touched the part of you that has ever felt overlooked or underestimated or quietly loved in a way you couldn't recognize, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And share it with someone who needs to hear that being the easy one doesn't mean you weren't seen. Sometimes the people who see us most clearly are the ones who never said so out loud. My name is Renee Calloway. I'm 38 years old. And I keep a trash bag on the shelf above my desk like it's the most important thing I own. Because it is.